They told us Volvo was Swedish. They told us Aston Martin was British, James Bond's own garage. They told us Mercedes-Benz was as German as it gets, the company that invented the automobile back in 1886. None of that is false exactly, but pull the shareholder filings behind all three badges and the same name keeps turning up, again and again, a Chinese billionaire named Li Shufu, who started out selling refrigerator parts. He doesn't own all of them outright. He never needed to. A board seat here, a blocking stake there, and for the better part of 2 decades almost nobody noticed him quietly collecting the set. So how does a farmer's son from a small city in eastern China end up wired into 3 of the most storied names in Western motoring at once? You have to start with a refrigerator factory that wasn't even his first idea. Li Shufu was born in 1963 in Taizhou, a working farming town in Zhejiang province, the kind of place central planning had never bothered to industrialize. At 19, his father handed him 100 yuan, worth about $16 at the time, and Li used it to buy a camera and start photographing tourists for cash. When the local government shut that down for lacking the right paperwork, he moved into scavenging scrap electronics for slivers of silver, then into manufacturing refrigerator parts in 1986, then whole refrigerators under a brand called Arctic. Business was good enough that by the late 1980s his little operation was worth several hundred million yuan on paper. Then, in 1989, Beijing began issuing official refrigerator production licenses to a chosen list of state-approved manufacturers. Arctic wasn't on it, so Li pivoted again into aluminium decorative building panels with his brother, then into motorcycles in 1994, chasing the first wave of Chinese families who could suddenly afford private transport. By 1997 he wanted cars. China's auto industry was walled off for state-owned giants and their foreign joint venture partners, and a private moped maker from Taizhou had no business applying for a manufacturing license at all. He applied anyway year after year, while he picked up a master's degree from Yanshan University almost as an afterthought, and eventually wore the approval down. His first attempt at a car, cobbled together before Geely even had its license, was a crude copy of a Mercedes-Benz body, bolted onto scavenged parts, the kind of thing that would have gotten laughed out of any state-run design office in the country. He had no way of knowing that one day his own name would sit on that same German company's shareholder register. Geely became China's first privately owned car company anyway. Nobody outside China noticed. That was still 13 years before anyone in the West would have a reason to. Geely spent the 2000s building cheap, forgettable cars for the domestic market, the kind Western journalists mocked in crash tests and safety ratings and never expected to see badged anything else. Then, in 2010, Li did something nobody expected from a company that size. He bought Volvo. Ford, gutted by the financial crisis and hemorrhaging cash from its failed Premier Automotive Group experiment, sold Volvo cars to Geely for $1.8 billion, a fraction of the $6.4 billion Ford had paid for the same company just 11 years earlier. Inside the industry, people called it a snake swallowing an elephant. Geely didn't stop there. It had already bought a 19.97% stake in the maker of London's black cabs back in 2006, and in 2013 it bought the rest of the company outright. In 2015 it launched a ride-hailing venture called Cao Cao, and quietly acquired the Polestar name for future use. In 2017 it picked up Malaysia's Proton, and, folded inside that same deal, a 51% stake in the British sports car maker Lotus. That year, it also grabbed 8.2% of AB Volvo, the separate Swedish truck maker, and a 34% stake in Renault's South Korean operations. In 2021, it launched Zeekr as a standalone premium electric brand and within 4 years, quietly moved to buy out every remaining outside shareholder and take full ownership. By the end of the decade, Geely held stakes in half a dozen car companies across 3 continents, and most Western buyers had never once heard of Geely, let alone Li Shufu. Then, in a single week in February 2018, Li did something that had nothing to do with buying a company outright at all. He went after Daimler, the parent of Mercedes-Benz, and he did it without telling a soul. For more than a year, a small team inside Geely worked to build a position in Daimler stock without ever tripping the wire. German law requires any investor to publicly declare themselves once their voting rights cross 3%, and again at 5%. That's the rule that forces a buyer to show its hand before it gets too big to stop. And it's exactly what Li's team spent a year engineering around. Using a Hong Kong shell company called Tenacious Prospect Investment, incorporated that October with a single ordinary share worth about 12 cents, plus structured derivatives, bank financing arranged with help from Morgan Stanley, and share options that never technically entitled Geely to the underlying stock until the last possible moment. Li assembled his position piece by piece, in the dark, and only converted the whole thing into real, disclosable shares all at once. When Daimler finally filed the notice in February 2018, the number attached to it was 9.69%, worth roughly $9 billion, and it made Li Shufu the single largest shareholder in the company that makes the S-Class overnight. One Daimler executive later admitted that Li becoming a shareholder wasn't the surprise. How he went about it certainly was. Nothing about the maneuver broke a single German securities law. That was the entire point. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a lucky trade. It was a choice, engineered patiently for a year, to become the biggest single owner of a 132-year-old German icon without anyone getting the chance to object until it was already finished and filed. The pattern didn't stay a one-time trick. It became a habit, and the next time it played out in broad daylight instead of a Hong Kong shell company. A B Volvo, the truck maker Geely already partly owned, formally raised antitrust objections over the Daimler stake building, worried about a shareholder gaining inside knowledge of a rival's plans. Then, in September 2022, Geely turned up again, this time on Aston Martin's books, buying a 7.6% stake in a company drowning under roughly £868 million of debt after years of production delays and razor-thin margins. It was sold at the time as a strategic lifeline for a cash-strapped British icon. It was actually a foothold. 8 months later, in May 2023, Geely came back and more than doubled it, paying a 45% premium over the closing share price to buy 42 million shares directly from Chairman Lawrence Stroll's own U-Tree consortium and subscribing for 28 million new shares on top, pushing its stake to roughly 17% for a total commitment of about £234 million. That made Geely the third largest shareholder in Aston Martin, behind only Stroll's U-Tree at 21% and Saudi Arabia's public investment fund at 18%. The deal came with a non-executive board seat, a second observer seat, and a standing right to buy even more shares if any outside bidder ever tried to take the company first. 3 luxury names, 3 separate stakes, 1 investor's fingerprints on every one of them. But Aston Martin wasn't the last nameplate quietly filling up with the same investor's name, and the next complication wasn't going to come from inside a boardroom at all. None of this happened in a vacuum. Western legacy automakers spent the back half of the 2000s and all of the 2020s getting squeezed from every direction at once. An EV price war led by Chinese manufacturers like BYD building cars for less than Western rivals could even source the battery cells for, tightening emissions rules that demanded billions in fresh capital every single year, and a software and autonomy race that most heritage luxury brands were quietly losing to companies less than half their age. Capital had to come from somewhere, and increasingly the capital that showed up with a checkbook already open was Chinese. Daimler, rebranded Mercedes-Benz Group in 2022, wasn't only dealing with Li Shufu either. BAIC, the Chinese state-owned automaker with its own decades-old joint venture inside China, building Mercedes vehicles for local buyers, had been quietly building its own position in the parent company too, and by the mid-2020s, BAIC's stake had climbed to 9.98%, edging past Li Shufu to become Mercedes-Benz's single largest individual shareholder outright. Add the 2 positions together, and you get 19.67% of one of Germany's proudest industrial names sitting in Chinese hands. One private, one state-owned. Neither one publicly coordinating with the other, both arriving at the same conclusion at the same time, for the same reason. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was 2 separate buyers recognizing the same opportunity a capital-starved industry kept leaving on the table, year after year, deal after deal. But it wasn't only outside pressure. The complications were compounding from inside the boardrooms too. Volvo Group's antitrust discomfort over the Daimler stake building never fully went away, even after regulators quietly declined to intervene. Aston Martin, still carrying enormous debt and burning cash on its transition to electrification, needed Geely's money more than Geely needed Aston Martin, and that imbalance handed Li's team leverage that outlasted the original investment by years. The brands themselves weren't exactly making the scale case either. In early 2026, two of Geely's own electric platforms, Volvo's EX30 and the Smart Joint Ventures models, issued separate high-voltage battery fire risk recalls within weeks of each other. A reminder that owning 6 car companies at once doesn't automatically mean any of them are built better than one. Industry analysts who'd spent careers tracking cross-border auto deals started saying the quiet part out loud. This wasn't diversification anymore, it was accumulation. Ask a dealership owner in Alabama moving Mercedes GLEs off the lot, and there's a decent chance they had no idea a Chinese state-owned automaker held a bigger piece of the company than any German bank or pension fund ever had. And across every one of these companies, the same uncomfortable questions started circulating in private among executives who wouldn't put their names to it. What happens when one investor sits on the board of a company and holds a meaningful stake in one of its direct competitors at the same time? Nobody in Stuttgart, Coventry or Gothenburg had a clean answer, and nobody wanted to be the one to ask it out loud in a shareholder meeting. Then came the year the paperwork finally stopped being a boardroom problem and became a Washington one. On May 21, 2026, the United States House Energy and Commerce Committee voted 48-1 to advance H.R. 7389, the Motor Vehicle Modernisation Act of 2026, a bill built to block automakers with ownership ties to a foreign adversary government from manufacturing, importing, or selling vehicles in America for 5 years, with China, Russia, and North Korea named explicitly in the text. Buried inside a companion measure, the Connected Vehicle Security Act sat a 15% foreign ownership threshold, meant to catch exactly the kind of stake-building Geely and BAIC had spent a decade perfecting. Somebody in Washington eventually did the math on Mercedes-Benz. BAIC's 9.98% plus Li Shufu's 9.69% added up to 19.67%, comfortably over the line, on a company that employs more than 11,000 Americans and has rolled over 4.5 million vehicles out of its Tuscaloosa, Alabama plant alone. Committee Chairman Ted Cruz admitted on the record that the bill, exactly as written, would sweep in the maker of the S-Class and said, "We would never consider banning Mercedes-Benz, insisting the language would need to change before it ever became law." One trade policy analyst put it more bluntly: a private investor like Li Shufu presented a genuinely different risk profile than a state-directed shareholder like BAIC, and treating both identically risked costing American jobs over a distinction the bill never bothered to draw in the first place. It was the single biggest number in this entire story. Legislation drafted to punish predatory Chinese state capital had just cleared committee, 48-1, still carrying language that would, almost by accident, ban one of Germany's most beloved car companies from American roads, over 2 ownership stakes most of its own customers had never once heard of. And unless that 15% threshold got rewritten, it was wide enough to catch Volvo, Lotus and Polestar too, right along with it, with no exemptions guaranteed. What followed wasn't a fix. It was a scramble that months later still hasn't landed anywhere. Lawmakers acknowledged publicly that the bill needed revision, but no exemption language has actually been finalised. Instead of standing on its own for a clean floor vote, the Motor Vehicle Modernisation Act got folded into a much larger, once-in-5 years surface transportation reauthorization package, stuffed with unrelated provisions on right-to-repair rules, automatic emergency braking mandates, and electronic door latch safety standards, the kind of grab-bag bill that can take years to clear a floor vote, even when nobody's fighting over a single line inside it. Meanwhile, not one of the companies actually named in the controversy did anything. Mercedes-Benz declined to comment, citing a standing policy against weighing in on pending legislation. Geely didn't sell a single share. BAIC didn't sell a single share. Li Shufu didn't so much as issue a press release. The threat that was supposed to force a reckoning turned into exactly the kind of paperwork nobody in Beijing needed to lose sleep over. Real on a page in Washington, invisible everywhere else, moving at the speed government bills move, which is to say barely at all. The one turnaround that did happen only tightened the grip further. Polestar, the EV brand Geely had spun out of Volvo back in 2017, had spent years burning cash faster than it could sell cars, and by the end of 2025 it owed hundreds of millions of dollars it had no easy way to repay. So, in December 2025, Polestar converted roughly $300 million of debt owed to Geely into stock instead, handing over more than 15 million new shares. 3 months later, in March 2026, Volvo's own financing arm converted another $66 million of Polestar debt the same way. Each conversion was framed publicly as routine balance sheet cleanup, the unglamorous kind of housekeeping that barely makes a headline. Each one also quietly increased how much of Polestar sat in Geely's hands instead of anyone else's. The fix for a struggling Western EV brand turned out to be more of the exact thing the rest of this story is about. So here's where it actually stands right now. Geely owns roughly 80% of Volvo cars outright, and holds 51% of Lotus, while entities tied to Li Shufu hold something like 69% beneficial ownership of Polestar. That's the technical term for who actually benefits from shares even when they're held through layers of other companies, and it mattered here because on paper, Polestar still looks like an independent Swedish EV startup answering to public shareholders. Geely fully owns Zeekr, half owns the Smart brand through a joint venture with the very company it's also a shareholder in, holds about 17% of Aston Martin with a board seat to match, and Li personally still carries that 9.69% slice of Mercedes-Benz Group. Add it up across every one of those names, and there's barely a Western luxury badge left that doesn't have his fingerprints on the cap table somewhere. By the time you're watching this, the Motor Vehicle Modernisation Act may already be law, dead, or rewritten beyond recognition. Nobody in Washington seems entirely sure yet either, including the people who drafted it. The lesson of Li Shufu's decade isn't really about one country outmaneuvering another, and it isn't about villains either. Every one of these stakes was purchased legally, disclosed eventually, and welcomed at the time by the very companies that took the money. Volvo still builds boxy, safe cars born out of the same snow country engineering instinct that once made the company give its own seatbelt patent away for free, because saving lives mattered more than owning the idea. Aston Martin still means dinner jackets, and Silverstone and James Bond's own garage. None of that heritage is fake. It's about how ownership moves faster than the badges and border checks built to track it, and how a company can spend 150 years building an identity that a spreadsheet can quietly rewrite in a decade. But the badges aren't going anywhere. They're still Swedish, British and German on every hood, every advertisement, every glossy brochure sitting in every dealership. What actually changed is who gets a vote in the room when it matters most. The car industry has a term for slapping a different nameplate onto a shared underlying platform. They call it badge engineering. It turns out you can badge engineer a balance sheet too, and the customer signing the finance agreement never has to know whose name is really on the title behind it. That's Volvo, Aston Martin and Mercedes-Benz today.